All right. Welcome everybody to the January 22nd Octant community meeting. Today we're going to cover kind of the update on O.10, which is the next release coming out. And then we're going to talk about what's going to be happening after O.10, and then we'll get into open Q&A and questions there. So I think some of our after O.10 will answer some of the questions that folks might have as well. So I am going to nominate Sam to go ahead and do the O.10 update on the spot, unprepared.
Sure, sounds good. So the biggest feature that we're looking at the upcoming O.10 release is going to be our terminal feature. So you can run container exec, and we've added this new slider widget on the bottom that will toggle up, and it'll have a series of tabs which will correspond to each container exec command you have when you're running Octant. And this one is going to be coming out fairly soon. I think here it says in the document, releasing this week, and I think we are pretty much at the stage of making sure that there are no outstanding bugs, and we're going to just do a quick check before the release comes out. We've also made a couple of quality of life fixes around CRDs. So I think there are a couple of bugs regarding CRDs, just either one, they're just not showing up, or I think there's another one where if the CRD has a very long name, I think it somehow gets cut out on the nav bar. So I think we've done the one where the CRD not showing up has been addressed, but the nav bar, I don't think that has been addressed yet. And we can see if we can squeeze that in O.10 by this week. Next one is going to be, let's see, hold on. I am actually super unprepared for this one. So I have to pull up the...
I can fill in the meantime. Sam did some great work on the port forwarder. The old port forwarder had a bunch of front-end components and cross-cutting concerns and things that weren't necessarily supposed to be on the front end. Sam went and refactored all of that so that the back end was providing all of the information as well as the using the standard set of components. So I think that was one of the few items that we had that wasn't just using our standard component library to draw stuff in the front end. We've also moved some of the information off of the summary tab, specifically the metadata information. It now has its own tab, and you'll be able to view that separately. Mainly, the driver for this was around annotations. They can get very long, and they would push a lot of the useful, like the immediately useful information on the summary page down well below any fold. You would have to scroll for a while to get to it. So in environments where there's heavy use of annotations, the summary page is now a little more usable, and all of that has been moved to its own tab in metadata. I think that covers most of the things. We also did some work around tabs breaking. This has always been kind of a constant annoyance of some tab will just not render, and you have to go digging through the console to find out what it is. And if you weren't running with the verbose flag, that was even harder to find. And if you were running with the verbose flag, you had to try and go back through the spam of error messages and log messages every 2 seconds and try to find and hunt your error message down. So now all tabs will render, even if something in the back end provides an error, and that error message will be rendered out to the tab, similar to the experience that currently was happening on like the resource viewer tab and in the main what's the main summary tab. So now all of those tabs will have that same treatment, and the output is a plain text error that is copy and pasteable. We use our YAML component to render it out, and even though it's not YAML, it's just actually take that back. We created a new error component which ensures that the formatting and things like that are not messed with on the errors that get rendered out. So they'll be easy to copy and paste into issues, and easy to kind of read and parse without dealing with the terminal. So is there anything else you wanted to add to what's coming up there, Sam?
Yeah. So this is also just a gentle reminder. We've actually made these commits some time ago, but they're still in the same release because this one's a longer release cycle. But just quick reminder that the there's some auto-generated code from the mocks, which are going to be checked in. And those are really just used for testing purposes. But it will now just come generated. It's checked in now, so you don't actually have to generate them. And this will be updated as part of the build files. But officially for the next release, they will come versioned. So this is something to keep in mind, and it'll be reflected in any build files or homebrew formulas and so forth. And the last one is also going to be, I think there's some work done around the K-logs. I think they were it's more of Octant. Sometimes they leave excess messages, and we're trying to do a little bit better on not spamming the console in certain cases. And there still are a few. I think there's one issue open this morning about if a user has a access token that's revoked while they are using Octant, that is still causing an issue. So we're going to keep addressing those moving forward as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Sam.
That's it. Yeah.
Any questions? We'll pause here. Take any, if there's any questions. I'm going to check the chat, see if there's anything. And then if not, specifically questions about O.10 and what's coming up. If not, then we'll move on to after O.10. How do you, oh, there it is. All right. So moving on to after O.10. So we've created a list of priorities around what we've seen from community requests. And I think as we go through these, it's going to cover probably a lot of the questions that folks have, because I see a lot of the faces here are people who've created some of these issues. So one of the priorities after O.10 is going to be plugins. We are going to make sure that the interface for plugins is consistent. We're going to make sure that we are providing the ability for plugins to be created without needing to download the entire planet. So the goal here will be to create a library for plugins that will still exist within Octant, but you'll only have to just import that specific package. So to be just like you do now with Octant package plugin, and then it will not have all of the hard requirements on the rest of internal and things that make developing plugins and testing plugins difficult. Right now, I went ahead and attempted to do a plugin that was just kind of in its own repository and didn't have Octant embedded alongside of it. And that proved to be a difficult task. So we are all working on making that interface better and removing some of the leaks of the internals of Octant that go out into the plugins. The downside of this is that there probably will be some, depending on how your plugin is implemented, there probably will be some breaking changes to the API, but we will be sure to deprecate that and then break them. Even though we're not in a 1.0 release, we usually find it's not kind to just break people right out of the gate. So we're gonna make some fixes in the next release around plugins and the interfaces that are exposed, and make sure to put some deprecation warnings in there for things that might be going away. A lot of those are going to be, some of them we won't be able to put warnings in for, because they're things like we are accessing fields where we're accessing properties of a struct directly instead of, we didn't provide a wrapper interface around it. So we will be able to provide wrappers around those, and in those wrappers, we can create some comments and some documentation around it to kind of direct people to using them. But there's just, because of the way we did some things, deprecating all of the areas that will break will be difficult, but we will do our best around that. So the other area that we're going to be looking at is documentation. This ties in with plugins as well as just general use documentation. Right now, it is, as someone had mentioned earlier, I think it was Andy, it is difficult to get started in Octant, especially if you want to develop against core Octant. There is not a lot of developer documentation. There's not a lot of help. It's kind of, we just kind of toss folks in and expect them to have to go and reverse engineer things and walk the code and figure it all out. And that's not very friendly and not very accessible from to get people, contributing, and also just for us as well. Like Sam and I have both had the experience of coming back to our own code and having to spend too much time walking through it because we didn't have good dev and API documentation around things. So you can expect that probably in two forms, probably in a more guided tour on the octant.dev website, but then also as general Go documentation that will be auto-generated. And the Go documentation will be more geared towards those who are exploring the internal API and developing against specific areas within there. And then the external high-level overview will be a more gentle introduction for folks who are just getting started, and kind of do some high-level overview of Octant and its data structures and its runtime and just how it all works and fits together, to give folks a general idea of what their kind of the architecture and the approaches that were used. That can be helpful when you're just getting started out on a new project.
If you need a guinea pig on any of that or help doing it, just feel free to give me a shout. I'm happy to help wherever I can.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. I definitely will be doing that. I'll probably try to get something going through that issue that I saw that you created, and we'll just make sure that we're communicating through that as best as possible, and then we can take some time to do some Zoom meetings as well.
Wonderful. Thank you.
One of the other things we're going to be looking at after O.10 is kind of getting the conversion process of getting Octant moved to a full application. There's been some rough prototyping work and some conversations that have happened around that, and we're going to be using Electron to package up everything and ship binary executables for Windows, Mac, and Linux. So that's something that's going to be coming soon, and part of the application updates will be some workflow improvements, and these workflow improvements will be things like not having delete buttons for nodes, like having the proper language around nodes for draining. Being able to start Octant without a kubeconfig present, and not have it just crash out. Things that folks have been asking for, and things that we've been wanting to do around just like the workflow and how Octant starts up and how you start using it, and what kind of what your first experience is with it. All of those are going to be kind of complementary to turning Octant into a full application. So expect a lot of updates around that as we go forward in the community meetings, and there's been some issues created around it as well that will keep folks informed. And then one of the other aspects of this is the Monaco editor, which is the same editor that is used in Visual Studio and other tools. We're going to be first doing an integration of that as a read-only implementation for the current YAML viewer. And then that is kind of going to be the starting point for the smart editing that has been discussed. And there's issues on the GitHub repo for this. That will be probably one of the stretch goals. Hopefully we will. I think it is likely it'll get in there. It'll definitely get in there as read-only, is what I'm saying. But we'll see what we do after we get the read-only integration. If we're able to get some context-sensitive editing in place in the next release, it will depend, and it will see. Is basically the answer. We'll see. So, so that's O.10. after O.10 updates. There is a question here that kind of ties into the plugin section. So providing kube context to plugins. This is a question that has been, I think Josh asked this question a while ago. And for those of you that don't know, he authored the Blood Orange IO Octant Helm plugin, and it was one of our first public plugins. And so the question here is about the Helm library requires requires more than just access to the API, because it makes some out-of-band calls to do some of its work specifically for deletes. And the question was, would we be able to expose I think the original question was, could we get the entire kube config exposed to the plugins? And we kind of settled on the context and a context change callback. And so I think the result was that it technically would not solve the issue for the vendored clients, because it wants a new config completely. But what we've landed on is that because of the way Octant functions, we can't just pass a kube config to a plugin and expect there to be good outcomes over the long term, because I think plugins will always need to know what the current context is to be doing their work properly and in the right namespace. So passing the entire kube config is probably not something that we'll be able to support.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So I just saw your comments and added that a few minutes ago. Is there a recommendation then for tools that are vendoring in Client Go? Is there any option for them to make calls through Client Go, or are they just essentially going to have to refactor things to use the Octant plugin API?
Yeah. So there may be. So this is something I think we can look at. I'm wondering if it is possible to satisfy this client, because the new for config, you pass in this REST config and you get back this client set, and then you're able to kind of go through all of the discovery client, auth client, all of that stuff. And I'm wondering if there's a way that we can create to satisfy that client set interface for plugin authors, so that they can get a client set interface that could then satisfy the needs of so then instead of having the vendor library call Client Go directly, it could use the one that gets passed in.
Sure. Yeah.
The problem with that is I think most of them it's pretty deeply embedded. It's like some setup function somewhere that calls to fetch the client and then returns it out up the stack and then uses it internally. And many libraries don't provide a way to override where the client comes from. They all just assume they're always going to get it from Client Go. And I'm
if there's a way to do this, I could work on the Helm side to basically add an option to use that.
Okay.
Yeah. Right now, there's really not an option for me to delete Helm releases without copying code from Helm and changing the delete calls to Octant delete calls, I think.
Okay.
Because it's all kind of black box behind a delete function that finds the resources tied to the Helm release and then deletes them. So.
Okay. Yeah, I think we can work on this some more and try to get a way that we do want folks to be able to not have to run out of band processes with their and like go find the kube config and then subscribe to the context change function, and then when you get the context changed event, go into the kube config and fetch that context out and make your own client. Like, we want to avoid folks having to do that. So I think we can work together to try and figure out a way to get that delete functionality in place.
Awesome.
So yeah, I just need to explore how Helm's doing things a little more, and then you and I can chat either via that ticket or on Slack about some options.
Okay, yeah, feel free to reach out. I can test some things on my end. But yeah, I didn't want to like try to come up with some like bespoke implementation if there's a lot of changes going to the plugin stuff. So that's all I got.
Okay, great.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
All right. So I think that covers at least what's in the open Q&A. Are there any other any questions from folks that I didn't answer when I went through the after O.10 stuff, or just general questions that people might have? Don't see anything. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time out of your days to join us, and we'll see you next week.